Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. One of the biggest problems with environmental pollution is that much of the time we are not even aware of its presence because we cannot see or smell toxic pollution. Public information about pollution is thus essential if we want to protect our health and push for policies that protect our environment. Now, one institution that has been essential for this task is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which provides most of its data in these areas. However, even for most lay people, their data is very difficult to understand. The Political Economy Research Institute, or PERI, thus provides this data in a more accessible form. As part of this work, PERI just released their annual Top 100 Polluter Index in each of three key areas: air pollution, water pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. And joining us today to discuss these indexes and what they mean is Professor James Boyce. James is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's also the director of the program on development, peace building, development, peace building, and the environment at the Political Economy Research Institute. James, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So James, what are the Toxic 100 lists, and why does your organization, PERI, why do they provide this information?
Well, we have three lists, as you mentioned. The two that we've just updated in the past week or so have been the air and water pollution lists, and the Greenhouse 100 was updated earlier this year. And what we do in these lists is use the data that's provided by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on individual industrial facilities, and we add up for those across those facilities the corporate responsibility for pollution of these three types: air, water, and greenhouse gases. So our main contribution is simply taking the facility level data that EPA makes available, identifying who owns those facilities, and coming up with totals for individual companies. The Toxic 100 lists rank those companies for the top 500 firms in the United States as they are ranked in terms of their size by the Fortune 500, S&P 500, etc. We also, on the Toxic 100 website, have a lookup facility so that one can find information about any firm that reports its emissions to the EPA.
So James, what do you think ought to be the consequences for companies that are towards the tops of these lists?
Well, the purpose for which EPA collects these data is to get a better idea itself and to give the public a better idea of what's going on, of who's doing what and who's emitting what into our environment. So when countries are at the top of the list, it's a warning signal that something may be going on that deserves closer scrutiny from the public, closer scrutiny from other stakeholders, including shareholders, closer scrutiny from the environmental compliance people in the companies themselves, and potentially closer scrutiny from the regulatory agencies like the EPA and the state departments of environmental protection. So what the data are collected for by EPA is precisely to achieve these two objectives of serving the public's right to know and of providing information to stakeholders, including the regulators themselves.
So James, just how bad is the situation? I mean, more generally, is a company that's on the list of top 100 polluters, like how does this work? Like, how much are they polluting exactly?
Well, the basis for the rankings on the lists, let me talk about the air and water lists, since those are the new ones that have just come out, are data that the companies themselves submit to the EPA about their releases of hundreds of different toxic chemicals into our air and water. That is done by the companies as a result of the right to know legislation that was passed in the U.S. in the 1980s in the wake of the great industrial accident, the Bhopal chemical disaster in India, which happened at a U.S.-owned plant. In the wake of that, Congress passed legislation creating something called the Toxics Release Inventory that requires facilities that meet certain reporting requirements to submit every year annual reports to the EPA on their releases of toxic chemicals into the air and water. In the 1990s, in order to make that information more useful in terms of targeting which facilities deserve the greatest attention, the EPA launched a project called the Risk Screening Environmental Indicators Project, RSEI or RISI, which added to that TRI information on the quantity or mass of toxic releases, information on how toxic different chemicals are, because some of the chemicals on the list are as much as 10 million times more toxic than others, pound for pound. So just adding up the pounds doesn't necessarily give you the best indication of which are the facilities and firms of greatest concern. Then in addition, the EPA looked at the fate and transport of these chemicals in the environment, how long they persist, where they're blown in the air, etc., and how many people are exposed as a result. So taking all of that into account, the EPA created this risk screening environmental indicators database, which is the basis for our rankings. Again, what we simply do is add up for the facilities to get the totals. So if a facility ranks very high or a company ranks very high on these lists, it suggests that there may be a problem. Occasionally, it turns out that the problem is that the data were misreported by the company. We've seen cases of that. One of the good things that our work here at PERI has achieved is that we've worked with companies to improve their reporting to clean out mistakes that are in the database. So these things happen, but the main bottom line conclusion is that where there are reports of very high levels of toxic emissions, they ought to be investigated. The public ought to know about it, and the environmental protection officials, those responsible for dealing with these problems, should know about it too.
Thanks for addressing that, James, because as you were explaining this, that was the question going through my head. So how are we to actually verify that these companies are providing this information in a very accurate manner? I mean, it seems to me if the EPA is relying on the companies to get the data, maybe the companies could fudge the numbers a little bit.
Well, that's always a potential problem. And unfortunately, at this point, there's not any real systematic checking of the numbers that the companies provide. So the companies have an obligation, a legal obligation under the legislation that created the Toxics Release Inventory to report and report accurately, or as accurately as they can, their releases. If they fail to do that, if they deliberately were to fudge the data, as you put it, they would be breaking the law, and so potentially they could encounter problems. In practice, my guess is that most of them try to report accurately, but in some cases, let's say they might be able to try a little bit harder. One of the things that potentially holds out hope for improving the quality of the data is the development of technologies for sensing pollution in the environment. When the TRI, or Toxics Release Inventory, was first created almost 30 years ago now, there weren't technologies available where you could, in effect, hold a little sensor up in the air and measure what's in the air very easily. That kind of technology has really come a long ways in the past few decades. And so there's a possibility now of, particularly in the case of facilities where the data indicate that there's cause for concern, of doing some testing on the ground, or in the air really, to see whether the reports are accurate and the models that map how the pollution is distributed in the environment are accurate as well. Something like this was instituted for the first time, as far as I know, by EPA in the wake of a report that came out 8 years ago that we collaborated with the newspaper USA Today and the Johns Hopkins Public Health School in researching. And that report, which was called the smokestack effect, I think readers can still find it if they Google it online, ranked all the schools in the country on the basis of their exposure to toxic chemicals as indicated by this particular database, the Risk Screening Environmental Indicators database. And in the wake of that, and by the way, the Johns Hopkins piece of that was they sent out people to monitor at the fence line of the school's exposures to try to test whether the data were accurate or not. And in the wake of that, my understanding is the EPA began some monitoring programs at high-risk schools around the country. Because the technology for doing that kind of monitoring now is become so inexpensive, it's possible to do it or will soon become possible to do it on a larger and more systematic scale. And that's something we can look forward to, I think.
So James, when did the EPA start providing these data to the public, and why did they start doing this?
Well, as I mentioned, the original motivation was the Bhopal chemical disaster, which was an explosion at a plant owned by a U.S. company called Union Carbide in central India that killed thousands of people and permanently injured tens of thousands. In the wake of that, there was concern here in the United States about whether some similar kinds of accidents could happen. And it was realized that the public and indeed the environmental officials didn't have much information about these risks, about what kinds of hazardous chemicals were being used, stored on site, or released into the environment. And so it was in the wake of that that Congress passed legislation, right-to-know legislation, that created the Toxics Release Inventory. And the basic underlying principle of that was that the public has the right to know about what's in our air and water and who put it there. That's the basic principle of right to know. And this was a great, really a historic achievement of the public and of Congress to pass that legislation and create this database. And that's really the foundation for what we at PERI have been doing with our Toxic 100 rankings. As I mentioned, the EPA then decided to build on this in another very valuable initiative by adding in information about the relative toxicity of the chemicals in the database and about their fate and transport in the environment and the populations thereby exposed. So that enables us to get a better sense of which are the areas, the facilities, and the locations of greatest concern. It also allows us to do one other thing that we've pioneered here at PERI, which is looking at the characteristics of the communities that are exposed. So in addition to ranking facilities and companies on the basis of the total risk, we also are able, at least in the case of the air pollution, to look at how that risk is broken down across the population in terms of how many low-income people and how many people of color are at risk. And what we very often find is that there are disproportionate risks imposed upon low-income communities and people of color. It's not always the case, of course, but it's very often the case that the impacts are not distributed randomly across the U.S. population, but are concentrated in particular places and particular communities.
So James, what is the added value by PERI? Explain to us what that means.
Yeah, well, I'd say we add value in several ways. The first is, as I explained, that we add up this facility level information to get information at the level of the corporation. It sounds like a simple process adding it up, but in fact it's a little bit complicated in that what it involves is tracking corporate ownership of individual facilities, which changes over time with mergers and acquisitions and sales and so on. So that's really our first contribution, is to present this information not only at the facility level, but aggregated up to the level of the owners who are ultimately responsible for the operation of these facilities. A second piece of value added is those environmental justice dimensions that I referred to, looking at the percentages of exposure that are imposed upon low-income people and people of color. A third contribution, I would say, is that we provide a platform to disseminate this information in a fashion that's reasonably user-friendly. One can go to the website, the toxic100.org website. One can find this information for companies. One can click and then find it for individual facilities, find it for individual chemicals at individual facilities, and so on. So we provide a portal with which to improve the public's access to information that is in the public domain. Finally, the work we've done, I think, has contributed to improvements in the accuracy of the data over time. As I mentioned, in the course of doing this work for more than a decade, we've been in touch with a number of companies who have contacted us to try to learn more about how they got the rankings they got. And in some cases, those conversations have led, I believe, to improvements in the quality of the data being reported by the companies. So really, the companies have an incentive to pay attention to the quality of their data, and indeed to pay attention to the levels of their toxic releases insofar as the public is paying attention. That's one of the great impacts of right-to-know policies, is not only does it protect the public's right to information about their environment, but it also thereby helps to advance our right to clean air and clean water, rights that were really won through a long process of struggle, and rights that will be sustained only if we continue to exercise them and are vigilant in doing so. There's what I would describe as a use it or lose it syndrome when it comes to this kind of information. If we use it, we'll keep it. And if we don't make use of it, there's a danger that we'll lose it.
So, James, we will include a link to the reports at the bottom of this interview on our website, therealnews.com. But can you say it aloud for people who need to hear it aloud? Where can we find this report that your organization has formulated?
So if you simply go to www.toxic100, all one word, TOXIC, the number 100.org, you'll go straight to the website where you can find all the information I've been talking about. Excellent. And much more.
All right. Well, we've been speaking with James Boyce. James is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's also director of the Program on Development, Peace Building, and the Environment at the Political Economy Research Institute, or PERI. James, thanks so much for that information. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.